The C++ standard library provides some simple functions for unformatted character I/O. Here I have a working copy of working.cpp from chapter 9 of the exercise files. And you notice this line on line 7, this call to puts. It has a C string, and when I build and run, it displays that C string on the console, terminated by a new line, even though the new line isn't there in the string. And that new line is what puts this program ended on the next line. So what puts does is it takes that C string and it displays it on standard out. Actually, more technically, what it's doing is it's writing it to a file handle, which points to the standard out console. And then it displays a new line, and then it flushes the buffer on that file handle. So there's another function called fputs, which does not add a new line and does not flush the buffer. And it also does not default to standard out. You can give it any file handle at all. And so here I'm going to just give it standard out so that it'll operate exactly the same as puts. Well, not quite exactly, because you'll notice when I build and run, program ended is now on the same line as hello world. And this is actually an important distinction, because puts without the F is not only adding a new line, but it's also flushing the buffer. And we'll get to the importance of that in a moment here. So fputs will write a string to a file handle. And in this case, we're using the standard out file handle for convenience. There's a corresponding function called fgets. And before I demonstrate that, I need to create a buffer for it to put the string in that we're going to type at the console, because what fgets does is it takes input from a file handle. In this case, we're going to use standard in. So I'm going to start by creating a buffer. And so the size of the buffer will be this buff size constant, and giving it 256 bytes. And then I'm going to create the buffer itself. And now I'm going to change this hello world to just a simple prompt. And we'll go ahead and use an fgets. So fgets takes 3 arguments. The first one is our character buffer. The second one is the size of the buffer, so that fgets won't overwrite the buffer. And the third one is the file handle that we're going to be reading from. And in this case, we're just going to use standard in. There are some other examples of fgets elsewhere in this chapter that show using fgets with a file. And so we're just keeping it simple here, using standard out and standard in. And then I'm going to go ahead and use fputs again to display whatever it is that I type on the console. And so that'll be the buffer, and the file handle will be standard out. So when I build and run this, it's going to work on my console. It may not on yours, and I'll explain why in a moment. So I'm going to go ahead and build and run. So first we have this fputs that puts out the prompt, and I see the prompt there on my console. You may not see the prompt on your console, and I'll explain why in a moment. So I'm going to go ahead and type something. This is a string, and when I press my return key, it'll read this buffer with fgets, and it'll use fputs to display the buffer on the screen. And so you see I get, this is a string, and you notice the new line, that's the return key. When I press the return key, that gets put in the buffer and it gets displayed. So a lot of times you will not see this prompt. And the reason for that is that fputs by default is not supposed to flush the buffer. And if the buffer is not flushed, then the characters are not actually sent out to that stream. And so in a lot of cases, in some libraries, it does flush the buffer, and in some libraries it doesn't. In the one that I'm using here, apparently it does. And all you need to do to make this work consistently is to put in a statement here, a function call called fflush, and the file stream that you want to flush. In this case, it's standard out. And now when you build and run this on any system, it will flush the buffer at that point, causing those characters to be displayed or to be written to that file. And then you can type in your string. Here is some more typing. And the rest of the code will work. Now, another really important note is that just like we have puts, which is a shortcut for fputs with standard out and a new line and a buffer flush, there's also something called gets without the F. And I want to say this very clearly, and I want you to be sure to remember this. Do not ever use gets. That's the version without the F, gets by itself. Gets works on standard in, but it does not check the buffer length. So it can easily overwrite a buffer, and this is a huge security risk. Buffer overflow types of errors are very, very common ways to take over a system and to spread viruses around the internet. And so you just don't ever want to use the version of gets without the F. Fgets, on the other hand, will read only up until the buffer size -1, so that it makes sure that it never overwrites that buffer. And so it's easy for us to just use stdin. We don't ever need the gets without the F. So these are the basic unformatted character I/O functions. Of course, these work with any file, not just with standard out and standard in, not just with the console. And these are a part of the C++ standard library, so they're available on every system.